All right, Kevin back with you for another episode of the $1,000,000 Relationships Podcast. And I'm looking forward to this conversation today. And today I've got Colin Gray with me. Colin, welcome. So awesome to have you, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you bet. And, I want to give a quick shout out to the folks at podcastguests.com. Those guys are doing an amazing work over there. And Colin, you and I wouldn't even be talking today if not for the work that those guys do in this world. And so I really appreciate what those guys are doing on that platform, putting podcast guests and podcast hosts together. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you today, Colin. I know you and I got to connect previous to having this interview today, and so I already got an idea of who you are and what you're all about, and now we get the opportunity to let our listeners know too. So what I'd like to do is just kind of start off by turning it over to you so that you can set some context for us and share what you do, who you serve, what inspires you most about the work that you do, and also give us some backstory, some of the backstory of how you even got here and how you got into doing what you do and the impact you're making in the world.
Yeah, sure. I mean, short story is we help anyone to start one of these exact things, a podcast. So that's been my kind of mission in life for the last 13 years or so. Is helping anyone start a podcast. We do that a couple of ways. We teach and we coach. So we have courses. We have a website that has nearly 1,000 blog posts on how to run a successful show. That's over at thepodcasthost.com. And we have a bit of software as well, which actually is a full podcast maker platform called Alitu. It's got call recording, editing, cleanup, and podcast hosting in there. So that's kind of what we do. It's just an ecosystem of stuff that makes it easier for people to create a podcast, a great show. And I suppose you ask about inspiration or passion around it. I think the thing that always comes back to for me is just the fact that I love podcasts myself. Like it was something that changed my life sort of 12, 13, 14 years ago. Listening to shows and learning and then starting to write about them as I was trying to figure out how to make them myself. And I just love the fact that they're so easy to create. They can teach so deeply. There's this kind of magical combo of, personality, but also in-depth, evergreen content. Like you can listen to a podcast for 2 hours at a time and just really feel like you get to know someone. So that's kind of why I love podcasts. And I think they really can change people's lives, both as listeners, where you can learn from, but as a creator too, where you can share your message or voice with the world. So that's the big part of it for me. Does that resonate with you, Kevin?
Yeah. It's interesting. So I am almost 2.5 years into hosting this podcast.
Yeah.
And we've done over 200 interviews for this podcast. And the better it gets, Colin. And I have been, I really appreciate the kind of work that you do, because I can tell you that the thought of having to do all the tech stuff around hosting a podcast, that would make me want to pull my damn hair out. And I just want to do what we're doing right here, have conversations like this.
And that's the case for nearly all podcasters. Most podcasters, they don't want to care about how it works. They just want to have a chat and share their message, share their voice, like inspire other people. So yeah, for sure. Yeah. That's where we try and come in, for sure.
Yeah. And I know I said this to you before we hit the record button, but I'll say it on record here too, that I've been an entrepreneur for 27 years, and hosting this podcast has been hands down the most rewarding thing I've done in the 27 years as my experience of being an entrepreneur. This has been such an amazing experience. And I look at what we've already done over the last 2.5 almost years, and I am just as excited for where we're going and where this is going to take us from here, because it is exponentially impacted everything that I've been doing. And I just can't even imagine life without the podcast now.
It's amazing because it has that effect on so many people. Actually, it's like I think it really surprises people the impact just a human voice can have on other people. Like if you put your message out there, there's no better medium for growing trust, growing relationships, you talk about relationships, it's growing those fanatical fans of what you do. There's no better way to do it. It's partly that personality that I talked about, the fact that I feel like people are so much more intimate and personal when they speak just into a microphone, as opposed to when they're trying to speak to a camera or something like that. It's so much more like a one-to-one conversation. But then you've also got that kind of way that people listen to podcasts. If you're putting out a video or something like that on YouTube, it's competing with so many other things. The attention is just so low. You're lucky if you can get somebody to watch, 5 minutes of a YouTube video or skim a blog post in like 30 seconds. But with a podcast, people are doing it while it's otherwise wasted time. They're in the car driving, they're walking their dog, they're ironing their clothes, things like that. And so that amplifies it into something that can last for 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. You get people listening to, podcasts for 3 hours at a time. So there's that combination of the personality, the intimacy, and then you've got that length of time. The two of them together, that's just it's just like a total power play in terms of developing relationships, trust, and fans of your work. It's just so powerful for whether it's a hobby thing or whether it's a business and you're looking to sell something through your show too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Colin, I can totally get why you're so passionate about doing what you do and being able to serve entrepreneurs like me. And I really appreciate you sharing that. And heck, I'm not a client, but I totally appreciate the work that you guys are doing, because you're right, helping people get their message out there and make a bigger impact in the world. That's what this is really all about.
Yeah, absolutely. So, thanks. Appreciate that. Yeah.
So let's switch gears here a little bit. Now that we've got some context set,
sure.
I'm going to ask the question for the benefit. I'm going to reiterate the question for the benefit of the listener. So, Colin, have you ever been introduced to a person or persons that completely changed the course of your life or your business, so much so that much of what you have today would not be possible if not for this person or persons? And Colin, I'm just really excited to hear your story and your experience around this topic of relationships.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it totally ties into the origin story for the business we run now, actually, which is why I didn't get into that before when you asked. So it's really, there was a guy, I was working at a university in Edinburgh. So I'm Scottish, if you can't tell from the accent. Worked in Edinburgh, and I was working at a college there actually originally, but then I got a job at Edinburgh Napier Uni, which is one of the couple of unis in that city. And I was just a learning technologist. So my whole job was to teach lecturers how to teach better, but with technology. So I was teaching people how to teach, but my sort of specialism was tech. And so there was a day when I was told by my boss, he came along to me and said, hey, there's this thing I've discovered. It's called like podcasting or something like that. Like, can you go and find out some more about that? It's like, okay, go and investigate. So I looked into it. And of course, this was podcasting. And this was back in about 2006 or so. So we're 2 or 3 years into the world of podcasting at the time. And I started to learn about it. And that was where the whole thing started. But the person that made the difference was I was then introduced to a professor of that university called Keith Smythe. So Keith was a guy who was teaching. He was teaching on a degree, a master's degree that lecturers would sign up to if they wanted to get better with tech as well. And I started to teach on this degree with him. And it was him really that introduced me to, or gave me the chance to teach podcasting, particularly on this degree. He'd started looking into it himself and he kind of handed over that course to me. And really that's where the whole thing started, because he gave me that boost and that place to really actually start to go deep into it. And because I was teaching podcasting to educators, that's really the impetus that took me into going so deep on it and really getting so into it. I'm not sure if it would have happened otherwise. It's really cool. So, there's people say like the best way to learn something is to teach it. I think that's actually really true. So I learned podcasting so in depth over the year or two following that because I spent those 2 years teaching it to lecturers at that university. Like every couple of months, I'd run a little course, and I created a podcast to accompany that course and all this kind of stuff. And so that's the whole thing. Like Keith was the guy that introduced me to it and really kind of pushed me to learn it, which if that hadn't happened, nothing that I'm doing today would have happened, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that totally stands to reason. You may not have ever even got into podcasting or been inspired to even check out and find out what it was all about, much less do what you're doing now and become an integral part of the whole doggone industry, you know?
Yeah. I think I have a feeling I would have always found it as a listener. I think it's a medium that just really suits the way that I function. I love kind of in-depth content. I love that, like I said, that personality, that intimacy. And I do a lot of walking. I do a lot of sports and stuff like that. So it's something that really suits me because I can get out and about and I can still have something that's going on in my ears, whether it's entertainment or education. So I think I would have always been a listener, but I think the teaching part of it made the big difference. It was the fact that I started writing about it at that point. And the story from there was that I started writing about podcasting. So I was learning it, but I was also blogging about what I was learning. And that was a public site. That was me just writing it out for free, just to help other people to figure out themselves. And that was the kernel of the podcast host. So thepodcasthost.com was a site all about being a podcast host. And really that over a few years, right place, right time, being in quite early, I guess, maybe a tiny bit of skill in the writing, I'm not sure, but all of those things together basically made that blow up over a few years. And that's really what kind of enabled me to then put a lot more time into that, grow an audience around that. That audience then drove, the questions they asked, they drove the products we create, the education we create, all of that stuff, and really kind of give you the, privilege to be able to create stuff for them and serve those people over time.
Yeah. Wow. And I've seen your YouTube channel. You got a lot of videos on your YouTube channel, and you got some videos with a whole lot of doggone views on them too.
Yeah, we've managed it. Yeah, we've done all right with the YouTube channel. It's kind of been up and down over the years. It's a funny platform, I find. But yeah, we've put out some good stuff, I think, and been lucky enough for people to find it. So yeah, it's been good fun. I enjoy video alongside podcasting. I'm definitely an audio native, but it's good fun putting together a video every now and again.
Yeah, very cool. So you mentioned that there was one other person that you wanted to honor in addition to Keith and stuff.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure we give you time to do that too.
Yeah, sure. So later on in the journey, I think it was when I was kind of trying to figure out, early on, we were really just content and teaching. So we were writing about podcasting, blog posts. We had some YouTube videos as well. Like you say, we ran a podcast. We ran a bunch of podcasts actually, but we had one core podcast, which was about how to podcast. It's a bit of a meta subject, podcasting about podcasting. But I was kind of trying to figure out next steps and how else we could help people. And I actually bumped into a guy at a networking meeting one night, a kind of business networking thing, sometimes quite boring. But on this occasion, I actually met a really interesting guy called Chris Marr. And he was running a local community around content marketing, he called it. And I'd been kind of doing this by accident, I suppose, in an amateur way. Content marketing. I was just writing and creating content and all that kind of stuff. And it just happened that people were finding it. But his expertise was around how to really kind of put some thought behind it and how to actually reach more people with that content and grow a bigger audience around it. And he was running a community called the Content Marketing Academy, which I got really involved in at one point. They ran an event for 3-4 years, and it was just such a great group of people, really based in my local area. So it was in Scotland in the Central Belt. And that changed a lot because actually over those 2-3 years, I started to realize how, structured you can be around it and how it's great fun creating content, but actually you can put a lot more planning into it. You can put a lot more thought into it. You can actually help people so much more if you actually, think about the levels of the content, the stages of people's journey through the questions they're asking, all that kind of stuff. And even more so, to be honest, the people in that community, there were so many people doing content marketing in so many different arenas, like so many different topics, that it was just so interesting to see how other people were doing it. And I made some great relationships in that community too, that many of whom are still friends these days too. So that was a big changer as well, I think, in terms of my mindset, how I saw what we were doing and how I then branched out and did a whole bunch of other things based on that.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. So these two of these guys, Keith and Chris, have both been really instrumental in just not only you just kind of getting into the world of podcasting and becoming such an integral part of this whole community and stuff, but also in just how you go about disseminating information and just sharing your gifts with the right people who can really benefit most from it and stuff.
Mhm.
And so if you look at both of these relationships, like you mentioned with Keith, you probably would have never even got into podcasting. But if you look over the years, these relationships go back a ways. Give me one example. I'm sure you come up with lots of examples, but give me one example where you were empowered, you got to make a really big impact. And you also know, hands down, that would have never happened if not for your relationship with either Keith or Chris, whichever one of them.
I mean, yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a couple of things spring to mind. One is
Okay.
a sort of simpler one whereby I really enjoyed making the impact with teachers. Teachers are such interesting people. Like, so there's so many different reasons people get into teaching, and working with so many of those lecturers, those teachers at the university in Edinburgh, it was such great fun working with them to be able to help their students. It was such a weird scale. I always appreciated that, the fact that if I helped one teacher, they then helped hundreds of other people. So, if I had a room full of 10 teachers at one of these courses, they'd go away and each of them would help 100 students every single year. So it was such a nice feeling to know that if I helped them to make something more effective, it kind of burst out in an exponential way. So that was one thing. Like, it was really cool to be able to do that, just to have those classes and to be able to improve the teaching or have a part in improving the teaching at this university that had a big impact on all these young people and changed their lives. But in a similar way, through Chris, the event that he ran, I was always quite a shy kid. Like, I didn't get up in front of people and kind of like, I wasn't a center of attention. I didn't like talk a lot. I was quite quiet. And then when I became a teacher, I had to kind of get over that in front of small classes. So I was teaching 10 lecturers at a time. It always just felt like quite a controlled space. I knew it really well. I knew all the people there generally. So that was a step up in terms of becoming a presenter, a speaker in a way. But it still felt quite safe. But through Chris, I ended up speaking on the stage at his event in front of about 200 people. And that was one of the first times I'd ever done that. And I was absolutely terrified. It was just something that I think if you showed my 14-year-old self me doing that, I'd be like, that's not true. That's like a complete fiction. I'll never do that in my entire life. But I got such a rush from it, and it felt such a big thing again. It was similar kind of thing. Like, if I had such an impact on all these people creating this amazing content, they then go and create something else better because of what I've said. And then they help thousands of other people that they reach as content marketers. It's just such a really cool, again, like exponential effect. And from there, that one thing that Chris kind of allowed me to do, encouraged me to do, and even a couple of speaking courses I did alongside him through him being really interested in that, I ended up speaking on dozens of stages to probably tens of thousands of people in total. Over the following years. And that was such a huge thing in my life. Like, gave me such a different level of confidence and a kind of self-confidence that I don't think I would have ever had otherwise, which carries on into all sorts of other things, not just work, but like personal life and all that kind of stuff. So that was a huge thing as well, actually. But I suppose you were asking about impact, but yeah, it's really about that, being able to have that impact, like standing up and telling people that stuff, speaking to people. It's such a cool thing.
That is awesome, Colin. I mean, wow. And I mean, and then there's this collaboration and co-creation kind of going on between you and them. which,
Mhm.
which allows, together, see, because this now, I mean, this is kind of what I do. I mean, I facilitate these relationships because
Yeah, yeah.
together we can bring our skill sets and our gifts and our unique abilities to the table and accomplish far more together with like-minded people that we have shared core values with than we can
Mhm.
ever do on our own. And like, what a perfect
Yeah.
example of that you just shared.
Great.
You
Yeah,
look
totally
like you
agree.
wanted to
Yeah.
say or something else, so I don't want to cut
Yeah.
you off.
No, no, absolutely. No, I just think it's, yeah, I absolutely agree. It's like, yeah, it's part of what I love about podcasting, the fact that the format is so suited to these conversations. Like, YouTubing, blogging, social media, a lot of that is it's one person transmitting to the world. But with podcasting, so much more of it is relationships, it's conversations, it's chats, it's two or more people talking and having chemistry and building something. And I think some of the best podcasts out there are about the relationship between the two people presenting. Whether
Yeah,
it is an interview like you and I right now, Kevin, we don't even know each other very well, but we can
yeah,
still have a good conversation and build some chemistry in a relationship. Or whether it's a podcast where you've got two co-hosts that have spoken thousands of hours over hundreds of episodes and
yeah,
they just know each other back to front, and the audience importantly knows them back to
yeah.
front as well, so they know the in jokes, they know the relationship. Part of it is just the fact that they love to hear these two people
That's
just
right.
getting on.
That's
It's
right.
such a cool thing. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a radio show in my local area. I don't normally listen to radio other than I take my kids to school every morning. And so during the ride to school, I listen to this radio show. There's these two guys that host it. And like, it's just fun listening to
Yeah.
those guys go back and forth.
Yeah, that's it.
It's
Yeah.
entertaining and it's fun. And then you look forward to like, man, what are they going to say and do next? So yeah, and same thing with the podcasting.
Yeah.
And so, well, and it's interesting. I want to, I don't remember which number it was, but he was definitely one of the first 10 interviews I ever did for this podcast. Alex Sharp.
Mhm.
He was a good friend of mine. Those initial probably, I don't know, probably 30, 40, 50 interviews, I just reached out to entrepreneur friends of mine and said,
Yeah,
hey,
good
I'm
idea.
doing this podcast now. I'd love to interview you on the topic of, your most valuable relationships. But one of the first 10 was Alex Sharfin. And the person that he honored was one of his high school teachers that taught
Mm,
speech. And he got put
yeah.
into that class on accident, but yet that teacher and him just totally hit it off. That teacher ended up getting him, I think it was a speaking thing at another school, which
Oh, nice. Okay.
now Alex has spoken. He speaks all the time now, and he's spoken in, like you, to audiences. He's spoken on television. He's spoken to audiences of thousands and thousands of people, and he is still friends with that high school teacher to this
Oh,
day.
that's excellent. Yeah.
It's just a lot of similarities between what he shared and what you shared, and the relationships that you have that just kind of really launched us in
Mm.
getting us going. And I am incredibly grateful to my friend Brad Costanzo for really just kind of seeing in me what I didn't see in myself and suggesting, Kev, you should really consider hosting a podcast because it has
Mm.
been such a rewarding experience. And
Yeah.
so
We
for
need
you,
we need
Colin,
somebody else. We need somebody else to point out sometimes, don't we? The things that we don't notice. We don't notice our own strengths. We don't notice the
totally,
things that we're doing well. We're so apt to, focus only on the negative. So yeah, it takes that sometimes, doesn't it? Somebody that
it
knows you
does.
well to actually just say, do you know what? You're doing this thing well. Keep doing.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, Colin, for anybody listening to this, they just say, man, Kevin, I really like Colin. I like what he stands for. I'd like to find out more about them and what they're doing. I know you kind of briefly mentioned the website, but any resources that you feel led to share, let's make sure we do that too and stuff.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, you can see all of our articles if you want to read about how to run a podcast. We're over at thepodcasthost.com.
Okay.
And we have a podcast all about it. So if you want to hear me and my friend Matthew at the company be talking about it every week. It's called Podcraft. So if you just search Podcraft in any listening app, that will pop up. And I suppose Alitu as well, if you really want to start a podcast, it's a tool we've built aiming to be the easiest possible way to do it. And it's just over at alitu.com. That's ALITU.com.
Nice. Very good. Well, Colin, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation today. I really appreciate that. Really appreciate you. Any last thing you feel led to share before we call it around?
No, I just reiterate, if there's anyone out there that wants to build more of those relationships, like you and I talking even before we started recording, Kevin, around the value of running a podcast, even if you never get anyone listening to it, just the fact that you have this excuse to get in touch with people, to talk to them for half an hour and build a relationship with them, learn from them, maybe teach them a little as well, whatever it is, like it's just such a nice way to actually develop that network, to learn and to create something really cool as well. So yeah, if you want to start a show, then yeah, start simple and get going.
Absolutely. And I can definitely second that. This has been an invaluable tool, invaluable resource for not only myself opening new doors for me to connect with other entrepreneurs, but also, as this guy who facilitates relationships that impact millions of people's lives, this podcast has become an invaluable tool in helping facilitate all of that too and stuff. So
it's great to hear.
It's been so rewarding and valuable on so many levels, and just such a rewarding experience. I cannot say enough good things about this. So if this is something that you are thinking of doing, or you're kind of I would encourage you, definitely check it out. And if it's feeling like it's in alignment with you, you know what? It might be just one of the best things you ever did.
Great stuff. Well sold.
Well, Colin, thanks again, man. Really appreciate you.
No, thanks very much for having me on. It's been an honor. Cheers.